Okay, so a little bit about me. I work at a place called Typeform. We collect data conversationally. That also kind of just looks like forms when you just look at it. My role there is Chief Platform Officer. Basically what that means is for our product, engineering, marketing teams, they don't really have to speak geek. We'll do that for them. That means developer relations, partnerships, and ultimately providing kind of insights from the field from our customers who are trying to integrate Typeform into their workflows. I also worked at PayPal and Braintree before, which I think any of you who've seen my talks or read blog stuff before, I've talked a lot about the process that we did there. And I think I haven't really been out in public much since I went to Typeform a year or two ago. And I think this is kind of a compare and contrast with what were the common patterns between, a 6,000 developer internal organization versus Typeform, which has gone from 50 to 200 people while I've been there. What are the common themes that work in all those environments? And it was also at UShip before, where we were doing a lot of public API stuff. So this kind of goes back to what I'm trying to share here. At PayPal, we were really going through a process of taking this kind of big ball of mud that they had for code and turn it into some microservice definitions across the board. We basically ran an API design group for all of engineering and worked with all those different teams, designing at least, I think it was like 1,500 URIs and about 500 different specs. And then at Braintree, which was acquired by PayPal, I also worked on a team in taking their kind of Ruby-based application and turning it into some Java microservices. Then at Typeform, when I first started there about a year and a half ago, moving my family from Austin to Barcelona, we were kind of doing the same thing, taking a PHP monolithic app, transitioning it to Golang-based microservices. Still very much on this journey, but we've now got, I think, a pretty good leg up on it. Just a few weeks ago, we launched developers.typeform.com. So yes, I am developer marketing here a little bit, but more importantly, what I want to kind of get across here is that these are our microservices. So the same services that we use to build the front-end application are the same thing that you're using as developers. And I think the fun part here is kind of all the stuff we had to go through to make that work out well. So there are quite a few other things that we have. There's not a lot on the developer portal now, but this is kind of the main things that people really, really wanted to use. And we're sort of constantly evaluating what other services we could open up. So there's a quick glimpse at our new dev portal. And the other relevant factor is we've, as part of this big microservices transition, been overhauling the front end at the same time. So we've got a big V2 launch coming up. And again, the only reason this is relevant is not that I'm telling you all about Typeform, but to say that our front-end application is basically our first client. So these microservices are serving to our own front end, so it's very much a dog food kind of situation. So, and by the way, I've dropped some links in here referencing kind of blog post stuff if you want to go get opted into that and see the new interface. I guess I should ask, does anyone use Typeform? Ever used it before? Not a lot of marketing and product people in the room. Okay, fair enough. So the point here is hopefully there's some process stuff that we can share here and kind of get plugged into the community a little more. This is probably the most relevant thing that I've learned across the board is that building APIs is kind of hard, right? When you start really getting it to an operational stage, it's harder than it looks. Right off the bat, the machine side is kind of picky, right? They're a little bit difficult to work with because everything needs to be efficient. You can't just go slopping things around. You got to worry about serialization. How big is the payload? How's that going to hurt the network, especially if you have mobile clients involved? You've got complex domains, which could have some big overhead in terms of processing and serving those requests. If you've got polling going on and there's any kind of inefficiency in that, it'll eat your lunch. I learned this the hard way at Typeform. And then the people side. People are difficult, right? They want to be able to understand things, so they have a lot of comprehension needs. They want the API to be self-documenting. This is the dream, right? You can just call an API and read what it says, and you understand what it means, and who needs documentation, which no one's ever accomplished that I know of. They want to understand the domain as a whole very rapidly and not have to, it's like walking in the door as a new engineer and saying, okay, I understand the whole domain in 10 minutes, I'm good. That's always your goal, which is rather lofty, right? Clear error handling. What's the first thing that you see when you try an API? It's usually an error, right? We just saw a whole thing describing in these logs. It's the first thing you see, so you have to be super clear on it. And then satisfaction. Anybody ever had like metrics they tried to put together on measuring developer satisfaction? You know, polling stuff? I've seen it before. It's useless. So they don't have to ask for help. Where developers are not innately, typically, very sort of exo kind of people. We don't really want to have to contact anyone. We want to feel smart and solve it all on our own. And ultimately, we want to be able to do everything the product does. Don't put walls up. Let me do everything I can do in the product, right? So, you know, then, of course, don't go down. Be super reliable. I always want your APIs to be up and running. So this is kind of all the stuff where it's hard dealing with the people side of things, and most of this is about kind of the outcome of the product, right? But the point here is that APIs are really the intersection of machine needs and human needs. This is what makes it hard. So for my money, you know, you've got to kind of accept that you need to make compromises. If you go in with the mentality that you have this rigid hierarchical system that you're going to expose in a rigid hierarchical way, the people will be dissatisfied, even if the machines are happy. If you provide something that's super human-friendly, chances are you're going to have scaling trouble. So you've got to kind of find a balance between the two. So you tend to have to put some kind of constraints on, typically you didn't build your application perfect. Right? Anybody feel like they've built the perfect application and they can scale it as much as they want? No, right, of course not. Okay, I'm hiring. You typically need to take what your system sees as very hierarchical, deep nested data and try to flatten it out, simplify it. And that's for the humans, not really for the machines in most cases. That's to make it comprehensible. And most importantly, you have to over-communicate with the humans. As we pointed out earlier, you need to be proactive in support. You have to know what they've done before they ask the question. You have to kind of guess and introspect what's going on. So, you know, in terms of which of these things will I pick to start on first, machines or humans, I'll always pick the humans because they're the more difficult ones. The machines are relatively predictable, and we can set those kinds of constraints. And as my reminder, salespeople are humans, and so are developers too, even though they don't act like it very often. Which I think I'm a little bit of both now, so I'm criticizing myself there. So on the business side, we need to make sure that when we're designing APIs, we're building microservices, we're building public-facing APIs, start with the business folks. Start with the people that are the least technical. Try to stick to kind of making sure that your product and management team folks have a high-level understanding of what the capabilities are in your microservices if you want them to matter to the business. Make sure that the language that you've used in these domains matches the language of your customers and matches the language of the business, which hopefully your business language matches your customer language. So really the way to do this is to focus on portfolio level. It's a little bit of a PayPal term, but the idea that kind of the categories, the sort of broad domains, and the resource level things, that they have visibility to it. If your business folks can go look and scan down a list of what all the APIs do at a very high level, and they go, yep, that looks like our company, they're gonna have a greater confidence that what's getting built matches up with the needs, and that hopefully you can tap into the folks that know those individual domains to correct you when you're wrong. I already said that one. I jumped ahead. Use customer language. Then really the first thing to start documenting, I think there's kind of a big push in a lot of places to do documentation first APIs. The idea being that you describe what it is that you're going to build before you build it. Much like we would do in any product development process, you write a story, right? So think of kind of as you're speccing out your API, that first description, make it just descriptive enough that the business folks can read it and go, yep, that's what we need. Right? If you can get that buy-in, then you're far more likely to succeed in the project and not suddenly have big surprises when you try to launch it. So the other piece, and this one I harp on a lot, I think it was a big eye-opener for me at PayPal, realizing we had a community of 6,000 developers inside the company, and what an incredible feedback tool that was. So look at your internal developers as your first developer community. If you can convince your own developers that what they've built is usable and reasonable, you're not far off from what the public needs are going to be. If your internal developers say this is useless, you don't stand a chance. So the most important piece is get feedback on your APIs from teams that didn't build it. The team that built the API, don't trust a word they say, because they know the guts of the system too well, and they're going to expose implementation. They're going to do things that make sense in their domain with the way they built it, but not necessarily the way that people want to use it. Share at a minimum sort of URL level stuff, some requests and bodies, getting down into kind of more the details, more than just that high level description, that high level portfolio stuff that the business folks need. These guys actually want to see the data that's getting transported back and forth. And really promote a sense of peer review. And this can take many shapes. You know, you could have an individual who's delegated to be the API reviewer, for any other domain. Or like we do is pretty much open up PRs against the spec stuff, tag the right people who seem to have relevant knowledge of that domain who don't work on that project, and just try to get, let's get a couple of stars on things before we call it good, or a couple of thumbs, whatever emoji you subscribe to. And then checking for adherence to standards with validation, and I've got a little bit more on this later. I should have put a link here. But basically, you should have some kind of standards written down for how you're going to build APIs. That could be, what a 400 means versus a 409, or down in the detail stuff, but it could also be kind of what patterns are we going to utilize, what naming conventions are we going to use. It helps to have other people to look. It also really, really helps to have some automation here, because people suck at this kind of stuff. I know that because I did it full-time for a year at PayPal, and I miss things all the time. And more importantly, ask your internal API users to build stuff with it. So one big, huge eye-opener that we had at Typeform, we had a Typeform challenge event. It's just kind of a rebranded way of saying hackathon that could include the non-technical folks, and asking them to use our developer portal before anyone saw it to build something. So we had teams build 23 different applications, some of which I think really opened people's eyes to what was going to be possible now. But more importantly to me was finding holes in the documentation, finding holes in those kind of guides and walkthroughs where people kind of got lost and had to go find somebody they knew that worked on that team to ask questions. So we did our best to capture all that feedback and use that to kind of tweak and tune content before we released. This is the important part. Everything I've said so far, if you're designing, planning to build APIs, and especially if you're taking a big, heavy microservices push, do as much of this as you can before you've built a single thing, as much as your developers will protest. So the point is to use kind of an API spec format. I tend to subscribe to OpenAPI just because, I don't know, community-wise, it's definitely reached that point. It's a Linux Foundation-backed project now. A lot of big companies behind it. But ultimately, use this spec format to kind of, instead of putting things on the marker board and taking a picture, write it out in an OpenAPI spec. You get used to it pretty quickly. It's pretty simple. And share those. Use it in GitHub. Share it between your devs. And you can start to get a sense of what it's going to look like before you've built anything, which is a heck of a lot cheaper than building and finding out you did it wrong. So, as I said, it's relatively easy to learn to do it from scratch. There are tools for making it a little easier to point and click. I tend not to trust most of them. And the other important piece here is, as I said, to bring those business folks into the discussion, you've got to do something to generate that raw OpenAPI spec into something readable for the non-developers, because they're not going to learn that spec format. I think for internal use, don't worry about it being the perfect internal developer portal. Get something up and running quickly so that you can start getting that feedback in. So we just grabbed a little JavaScript thing called Redoc that generates documentation from OpenAPI. Looks pretty decent. Looks kind of like Stripe's layout. We stood it up in a Docker and sent the link out to everyone, and immediately started getting feedback. It was great. So there's a quick shot of what that ends up looking like. That took me, I personally did this, and it took me like an hour. And I'm super rusty on any kind of coding. So it doesn't take much to share some kind of doc format of all of kind of the portfolio stuff on the left and the details on the right. So you have everybody bought in. The API designs are good. Now you're ready to do something. Ooh, I'm gonna have to pick up the pace. So there's a lot of stuff to code, right? We've got to do all the implementation and testing and routing and all this stuff. And most importantly, if something changes and everything doesn't change at once, chaos ensues. So The trick here is to basically, for each of your microservices, keep a YAML, I prefer the YAML because it's easier to read, YAML-based OpenAPI spec for everything. And then before you go to use it for any tooling, merge those down into one. I actually wrote a little thing, I just had to make up a name, it's probably bad, OpenAPI micromerge, that's in the Typeform repo for doing this, that we use to basically kind of mash up all these different microservice definitions into one specific bundle for a specific use. So we can automate things from this, right? We can generate mocks, which I'm a big fan of because now your end users that are using the API can give that tactile feedback. Devs don't actually read that often, so once you feel something with code, you get a better sense. You can also parallelize your front-end and back-end development here, and ultimately use this to maybe give some early access to external devs to get that kind of same feedback. Tracking a status, so OpenAPI has this notion of vendor extensions, which have been rebranded as just extensions. So use that to keep track of which things are proposed or in development or released, and just generate mocks for the things that are proposed so you can play with it before you build it. Server stubs, so basically generate the base of your server from the design instead of the way a lot of this started. You build the server and spit out specs. Do it the other way. Feels harder at first, but it makes a lot more sense. I would encourage that you find something that you can regenerate, because that way when the API changes, you regenerate the base. And a lot of them are not good at this, I would warn. Reference docs, as I said, there's a lot of open source options for this. And for generating SDKs, if you haven't looked at API-Matic, they actually have a booth out here. I love these guys. I think they do a great job at the generation piece and creating really nice native stuff. And they actually do walkthroughs for installations, which I haven't seen anyone do before. So we're planning to check this out. We don't have SDKs yet, but I think they do a great job. And validation, I think, honestly, is an area that a lot of people have not taken advantage of spec formats. You have a schema which describes what the payloads are. So when you get a request, or first of all, make sure that your specs match your implementation. So within your testing, when you do a test call, check it against the spec. Why not, right? Now you guarantee that your docs match your implementation. Stoplight.io has this nice little open source Prism proxy that you can pass your API calls through that checks it against the spec. It takes like 5 minutes to set up. It's super simple. Verifying requests, so this is what I was starting to say. When you get an API request, why write all that validation logic when you have a schema in your OpenAPI that you could use to do all the basic validation? Is it the right data type? Is it the right length? All that stuff. Don't write that code, validate it from the schema. And then finally, as I mentioned before, with kind of checking your API designs against your own standards, my colleagues at Braintree have opened up a thing called OpenAPI Lint. I did one before, but I think theirs is better. That allows you to basically describe what are your rules and run this against your spec as you wrote it to make sure that it passes the rules, which was a huge game changer at PayPal in terms of our capacity. And then routing, configuring all the different routes, you always have the potential to screw up and overexpose something that you didn't mean to, publicize one of those internal microservices you didn't mean to. So again, you have this notion of extensions, so why not keep track of, on an endpoint level, what the visibility is? This is consistent across every place I've worked. We do the same pattern. So you can say, this is external. Now when you take all those microservices specs, generate one output in JSON, you can just filter down to which ones are public, rather than doing it manually and having someone screw up. Yeah, that externalization configuration. Finally, visibility and versioning is another kind of common thing that pops up here. So visibility, is it public, is it private, is it partner? What scope are you going to externalize it rather than just public or private? So you can use that to generate docs, and then also double check that status I mentioned before to make sure that it's actually released. You don't want to externalize a proposed API, right? And then finally, versions. I think this is an interesting one that we're still playing with, really to provide for our API proxy the notion of version fallback. We have a platform version, but if we get a call for the current platform version that an internal API didn't really build for yet, we can fall back to what it is to an older version that they supported and externally maintain one version rather than a different version for each microservice. But there's stuff we have to do manually that we can't automate. So luckily, I think it's pretty simple. Guides in your developer portal, and hopefully your internal stuff you can do as well. Getting started and off topics, you need to spend personal time with those subjects to get it right. You're not going to be able to automate this perfectly. And then ultimately, the reference material should still be an open API format, but describing the endpoint will be manually written. You can't generate saying what it does, right? So largely your tech writing stuff, this is where you spend a lot of up-close personal time with the docs. And then within your SDKs, you're typically going to have convenience aspects that you can't automatically generate. It's very difficult to do this consistently, but do your best to generate the base and extend. And again, try to make it to where you can regenerate again. Last thing, we've got a lot of plans for kind of API community stuff that we've been a little bit slow to roll out. We've got a thing coming soon we call Jenny. It's a generator for Golang servers that basically creates that regeneratable API, the API server from the spec. Generates some tests, provides some observability and instrumentation, health checks, all that kind of stuff. I was really hoping to have this today, but we had some snags, so hopefully we'll have it soon. I'll tweet it out. And then that request validation stuff I talked about, we do that for our forms. When you go to create a form through an API call, we actually use the Open API spec to validate what's a relatively complex model. We're trying to abstract that out and open that up. And then our developer portal, you might notice, if you're a front-end dev at all, is React-based. So we're trying to get that separated out and opened up. And then all of our API management we built ourselves, which I'm still not sure was a good idea, but it's all based on Vulkan D. Any Golang people? Oh, God, not one. OK. Sorry, none of you care. So if you want to know more about our developer portal launch and some of the other kind of human factors with what we on how we collaborated, I wrote a blog post about that on the Typeform blog, kind of describing it. Just, I think there's a lot more stuff beyond what I said that you could learn from. Thanks. Whew.